Now, we've learned the 9th chapter of Nedarim, which is engaged with the annulment of vows. And I wanted to bring us back to a Mishnah, which we learned in Chagiga, must be a couple of years ago. And the rabbis say there, the annulment of vows actually fly in the air. There's no base in the Torah for annulling vows. And we've already said, by the way, okay, the rabbis, they really don't like vows. So they are keen to create space for them to be annulled. But there's no base in the Torah really for it. Having said that, the Torah does talk about revoking vows which are taken by a young woman or by a wife. And there we do have a pasuk. It's in the same, it's in Nasor, it's in the, it's in Matot Moseh. It's in chapter 30 of Bamidbar. It's in the same section where it says that someone everyone should keep their word. There's a mitzvah of keeping your word. But in the same passage, it goes on to say, if a woman makes a vow to the Lord or restricts herself, while in her father's household in her youth, she has to be binureha in her youth. And at that point, her father, if he hears about it, can revoke her vow. And by the way, later in the Parsha, we learn that a husband, under the same circumstances, can revoke the vow of his wife. So while we have nothing in Torah to support a sage annulling vows, there is discussion of a father or a husband revoking vows spoken by their daughter or their wife. And the last 2 chapters of Nedarim deal with these issues. And the Mishnah, we know that the Mishnah loves boundary cases. And so the 10th chapter begins by thinking about the situation of someone who's a young woman and she's in her father's house, but she's also betrothed. So there is a husband involved. She's somehow halfway between her father's house and her husband's house. So what is going to be the rule on annulling her vows while she's in this state? Na'aram or rasa, so a betrothed young woman. And the Mishnah says, Aviha u va'ala mefirim nedareha. Her father and her husband annul her vows. And we'll learn in the Mishnah in a second that this means both her father and her husband. They have to act together. So while she's in this in-between state, it's as though we're strict on both sides. Hefer ha'av velo hefer ha'ba'al, hefer ha'ba'al velo hefer ha'av, eino mufar. If the father annulled but not the husband, or the husband but not the father, it's not annulled. It doesn't work. Ein sorech lomar she'yakem echad mehem. And you don't even have to say that if one of them upheld it, then clearly it would stand. So the bias, whereas until now, we've seen a bias in terms of the feeding of the Mishnah, really a bias in terms of annulling vows, and certainly annulling pointless vows. In terms of a father and a husband revoking, well, we seem to see a bias in the opposite extent, that the vow stands unless both the husband and the father revoke. What if one of them dies? Meta av, lo nitrok narushut laba. If the father dies, his authority doesn't pass over to the husband. He's still needed. Meta baal, if the husband dies, nitrok narushut lav. If the husband dies, his authority passes back to the father. Because, of course, if the husband dies, then she's no longer betrothed, right? If the husband dies, she's no longer in the husband's reshut. In this respect, the father's power, is that the father's power is more beautiful. A power of attorney in modern Hebrew is yipui koach, something that makes power beautiful. And that it's a modern legal term, but it comes from the Mishnah. The Mishnah says yipa koach ha'av, the legal force of the father is more powerful than that of the husband, because the father survives after his death and the husband's doesn't. But in another respect, the husband's power is greater than that of the father. Shabal mefer bivgar, because the husband can annul when she's of majority. So when she's an adult and she's in her husband's house, the husband can annul. Ve'av eino mefer bivgar, and the father can only annul when she's a na'ara, when she's a youth in his house. Now, what happens? What happens if she vows and then she's divorced? If she's passing in and out of her husband's authority. Nadravahi arusa. So she vowed when she's betrothed. Nid garsha bo vayom. She gets divorced on the same day. Remember, she's not married yet. She's only betrothed. So the divorce is less significant than, you know, a modern day divorce, more like a breakup. So she vows when she's betrothed. She's divorced on the same day. Nit arsavo vayom, and then she gets betrothed on the same day. This is obviously to somebody different. And now get this, afilu leme'ah, even 100 times. And we've said the Mishnah loves these boundary cases. So this happens 100 times on the same day. She goes through betrothal and divorce. Or anyway, the point is there is no limit. Avia uvala acharon nedareha. Avia uvala. There's a missing word here. It should be hef. Interesting. There seems to be a missing word in the Kaufman or in the edition of the Kaufman. Father and her last betrothed husband annul her vows. So if there's a chain of betrothal and divorce, we still require the father, but we require the last husband who's still married to her. And there's a general principle. This is the general rule. As long as she hasn't passed out into her own domain, when she passes out into her own domain, in other words, she becomes an orphan or she becomes a widow or a divorcee, at that point she takes responsibility for her own vows. But if during this process she's never entered into her own domain, she's been instantly divorced and re-betrothed. So if she's never ever passed out into her own domain, even for 1 hour, aviha uvalah acharon mefirim nedareha, her father and her last husband, the most recent husband, annul her vows.